So let's go on a little walk. One thing I wanted to think through out loud is something I've been thinking about for quite a long time, and something that's been confusing me for even longer, I would say. And that has to do with sort of the coherence of the metaphysics of our current scientific mainstream perspective. Now that sounds technical and vague, and it probably is. Essentially what I mean is, what is the story that's being told? You know, the important contextual story that science is being done within. What's the picture that actually paints? And what's the picture that we actually see? And you know, I'm not new to this. Or I'm not. What I mean is, I'm not the first person to think about these things. And there have been a lot of smart people that I've been inspired by, you know, throughout cultures and eons, if you will. And the big difference is, the big difference is thinking about this story from an experiential standpoint. Now that might become a little clearer as we go on. So what is the story that mainstream science, modern science, states or assumes? I think we can summarize it in terms of reductionist materialism. And essentially what that means is that all phenomena in our reality, which we would equate to our universe, are reducible, emergent aspects of this construct which we would call material, the material universe or the physical universe. So, you know, that's something interesting and important to define in of itself. What is material? What is physical? But in essence, the idea is that this physical material thing is made out of reducible parts, and these parts can be explained and described, which in our case would be the quarks and the electrons and the other force carriers, described by models like quantum field theory and the Standard Model. And that every phenomena, sort of by rule of law, every phenomena is an emergent property of these constituent parts, right? So that every phenomena can be reduced to the behaviors and the dynamics of its constituent parts. Right. So I think where a lot of thinking has gotten stuck at, and very little progress has been made, is what has been aptly called the hard problem of consciousness. Because unlike every other phenomena that we've discovered, there's something weird about consciousness. And it's so weird that no one can really define it. Or rather, there are a lot of different definitions which make more or less sense in my opinion and perhaps the opinions of others. But it's evident that it stands apart for some reason. And in my view, or from my perception or experience, at least one way in which it stands apart is that within the story that we tell, it seems to be it seems to belong to a different category. It seems to belong to something that we might call subjective experience. It's qualitative, not quantitative. It's, yeah, as I said, subjective, not objective. There's something immaterial about the experience of, particularly feelings and emotions, but also the qualia, or the qualitative nature of color, and the qualitative nature of sound, right? So there seems to be these two descriptions of our world, which on the one hand have this objective quality to it. We can describe them in terms of our physical laws and their behaviors. But then there's the flip side of what it is that we actually experience, right? So there's the objective or physical half of reality, which describes a photon as a sort of quantum field fluctuation of the electromagnetic field, which has a certain dimension in space and time, which are denoted as the wavelength or the frequency, and so that could be sort of the objective description of it, but that is very little, if nothing, to do with the ontological, so like the foundational nature of what we experience as color. We know that causation doesn't equal correlation. We might say that a photon of a certain wavelength, of a certain physical property, correlates to the experience of blue, but on an ontological or categorical, from an ontological or categorical standpoint, it seems difficult or incoherent even, or illogical, to say that the quality of green or the quality of a sound is sort of equal to the physical description that we give. So that's one thing, and people have put labels onto these different quote-unquote problems, right? In general, it's the heart problem, but you can break the heart problem down into, I don't even remember, things like the I forget the names, but essentially, how can these two categories interact while allegedly being within one category that we call reality? They're categorically different, right? What's the nature of the thing that allows them to interact? The emergent problem is it's a hard emergence. It's an emergence unlike any other emergence we've seen within the universe, because how can we get an emergence of quality from what we're calling quantity, right? From what we're calling this physical universe and giving mathematical descriptions of. So there seems to be a problem in how we describe it, these two parts. There seems to be a problem in how the story we tell, or not a problem, but sort of a void, an unexplained aspect. But here's the crux, and here is where, in my opinion, it gets really interesting, because trained in science, right? Trained in science, we learn how important it is to remove the observer from our experiments. And for good reason, if we're trying to understand the behaviors or the science of the physical universe. But the nature of the observer, the nature of the experience, of the quality, of the qualitative aspect of experience must be part of reality. If we can describe reality as one thing, which our scientists are largely in consensus about, that there is a grand unification of our scientific laws, right? That's kind of this underpinned assumption, which has worked for as long as we've been doing science, is that there is a grand unification, and on some level that makes logical sense, right? We're describing reality. There's one thing that is reality. Anything outside of this thing that is reality must also be reality. So it's the set that includes itself, right? It's the one thing of existence, the one beingness of all things. And that must include the thing, if you will, or the things that we think the physical world is made up of. But it must also include the experience of those things. And here's the thing. That story, this reductionist materialism, says there are two different kinds of things. And that's fair enough. You know, that's fair enough hypothesis. And then we run into sort of the unsolved problems that we talked about a second ago. But there's one thing, and going back to what I wanted to say, trained as a scientist, we've removed the observer, we've removed ourselves from the experiments, but that does something it's kind of tricked us, and I can feel that in my own experience. It's kind of tricked us into abstraction. It's tricked us into mistaking our qualitative reality for this abstract physical construct that we've described with science. So there's this weird contradiction which has been difficult for me to really wrap my head around, but I can feel it. And let me bring it here, right? The photon that sort of bounced off of the ocean over there, or the palm tree there, or the stone there, right? I'm pointing there. These photons, the story we tell of this dualistic world, right, where there's a physical world and then there's our experience. These photons have traveled, hit our eye, gone through our lens, hit the retina, created some kind of electrical impulse. And then we say that the brain, out of that brain state, emerged an experience of the color blue, for example, right? But sit with this for a moment, right? The color blue is there. But the story says it's created here. Now, to a neuroscientist, that won't be too shocking, because in neuroscience, you know, they spend enough time thinking about consciousness from a materialist standpoint. And the recognition, which in of itself is profound, is that our experience of the world is like a projection. It's like a controlled hallucination, if you will, of the physical material world outside of our brain, right? So all of these things that we see are not actually the things that are there, according to materialism. These are the things that these sort of objective mechanical photons, or rather, we know they're quantum, whatever, that in this objective world outside of experience, they bounced onto our body, which is also outside of our experience, but then our brain puts together and creates this lifelike projection of what this inert physical world outside of our experience is like. And that's how we move around. Now, I think that was the first crux of what didn't really sit right with me. But that's what you need to reconcile in order to stick with the materialist worldview. But you don't need to do anything, but that is what the materialist story truly says. The experience, the qualia, the touch, the sight, the sounds, all of your experience happens within your personal field of experience, within your, if you want to say, in your brain. And another person's entire experience, entire world, seeming outside and inside, is happening in their brain. And these localized projections of the universe happen independently within each of our brains. I think that's really trippy to think about, because what we think of as space and time is somehow all happening in my brain, but my real brain I can't touch. I can't get there, because the only thing I can truly touch is experience. And it's kind of by definition, because you can only experience. And the materialist story says this experience, of course, it maps onto this essentially all-powerful construct that we call the material universe, the objective universe. So when I hear that and sit with my experience, it doesn't make that much sense to me anymore. Why do we need something outside of our experience? Why can't we stick with what we know? What if the world that we're interacting with is made of qualia, of qualitative experience? Maybe experience isn't what we've been taught. Maybe experience isn't this strictly human overlay onto an otherwise objective material world. What if material is an emergent behavior of experience? or of what we might call consciousness? What if humans aren't the only aspects of reality that is conscious, but a particular form or complexity of it? Yeah. What if we don't need the second category? What if we don't need this all-controlling, inert, physical construct that we can't see, smell, taste, or feel to exist to explain our experience? What if reality is experiencing itself? Or awareness experiencing itself? Awareness aware of itself? So, what if the brownness of brown is not separate from the photon and is not in my head, but it's here? We all already think it's here, right? That's intuitive. We all think we interact with the same world, with the same world that we're touching and experiencing. But if you really think through the materialist presuppositions or assumptions that modern science makes and has been making to the effect of not making any progress in consciousness, on awareness, that's what one needs to buy into. And it's quite a trippy thing to wrap one's mind around, no doubt. But it's coherent and it resonates with what a lot of cultures and people have already figured out. As I said, I'm not new to this. This is not something I've come up with, but something I'm experientially making sense of now. You know, this is coherent with what many cultures around the world have expressed about the world, reality as consciousness, that there is one consciousness, right? The grand unification of the physical world in description is the recognition of the unification of consciousness, and that what we see aren't separate, individual, localized hallucinations in our brains, but different angles, arguably infinite angles of consciousness expressing itself through experience, right? Experience is allowed to have the multiplicity and the structure that we're ascribing to a physical world, right? The physical world doesn't die. In our description, it's already dead. In this realization, the physical world becomes alive. We remember that it was always alive. And we remember that it was always connected. That we were all connected, not just through the stardust, but through our experience of it. Peace and love. Bye-bye.